welcome back to What's the Scoop episode number 33. Hope everybody had a great week. A little bit longer than usual since our last layoff. About 8 days since was last on. First off, I want to thank Trevor and Kenny for holding down the fort on my other show Thursday night on Settle the Scores over on the Rocky Mountain Sports Network. Appreciate you guys filling in at the last second there a little bit for me. The travels this weekend, and of course if you guys haven't seen it, the whole outage this past weekend definitely messed up a lot of people, but I'm just grateful that everything got worked out. And again, can't thank you all enough for filling in when that everything arose. So appreciate that, and want to just thank those guys for that and for all their help both this week and as usual. And I'm just excited to be back now, and I'm excited to get this show off the ground, see what y'all got on your minds, and talk a little bit about what's been relevant in the sports realm the last week and a half, a little bit longer than the last week, so last week and a half or so, and break into some of the very ever developing, I'll call it, sports realm. And in terms of everything, we talked about the MLB draft a little bit last week. We talked a little bit about where we're at with the NFL preseason, talked a little bit about NBA now that some of the trades and free agency have begun to die down a little bit. So no shortage of anything to talk about as usual, and looking forward to breaking into it, y'all. And as usual, Mr. Ronquillo says, good evening, Scoop. Good evening, Mr. Ronquillo. Thank you again for jumping in, especially on a different date and time. Thanks again for tuning in. One of the absolutely most avid and loyal supporters we've got both over at both networks, and very grateful for all the times that you've tuned in and all the comments you always bring in, and hope you had a wonderful weekend and a great week. And as usual, loving that Bo Nix jersey you got there in that profile picture. So coming into this kind of new week, I guess we'll say, a little bit into the week now, but coming into this part of the week, we've got a lot of baseball has kind of started to kick into the trade deadline season. And I'm not going to necessarily get into a ton of that, because right now there's a lot of this person's reporting this, or these teams are in on these guys, or this team may make a run at X player, whatever the case may be. I'm not going to really break into a ton of that, because newsflash, this is a BS monsoon season, as it usually is around the middle of July. Teams are posturing. Teams are trying to take advantage of other teams being willing to perhaps pay more than they would have a couple weeks ago for a certain player or for a certain position, and all of that. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the whole rumor mill that we're hearing right now in terms of all these minute and unique reports that keep coming out, because we're going to get about 50 a day from a whole bunch of different people, and half the time they're going to contradict one another. However, some of the more interesting and some of the more substantive aspects of some of what's being reported, or some of the more traction, some of the things that have a little more traction to them, I will get into a little bit more as the evening goes on, once we start to break in a little bit on specifics. So, excuse me. I'm going to start a little bit talking about just kind of where we're at as the second half kicks off. I talked a little bit about this last week before the All-Star break, but looking at where we are now with the playoffs, obviously a lot of teams, or in baseball, a lot of talk of obviously surrounding teams like the Dodgers, who I don't know how the Dodgers have as much money or prospects or whatever. There's talk about making a deal with the White Sox to get as many as 3 of their best players. And I'm not going to get into that a ton, because I just said I wasn't going to break into rumors, but just bringing up as that in particular, the Dodgers, they must be what the people felt about the Yankees 20 or 25 years ago, because I don't know where this team gets its endless foundation of prospect or endless foundation of money, but the fact that they just keep having realistic chances to go out and just make these transactions, it just makes me wonder, something really must be fundamentally broken with like 25 of these other clubs, because if a team that keeps getting rich can keep getting richer, I don't know how these other teams are just falling behind all that much. But be that as it may. So, but yeah, a couple of the deals that have been kind of reported the last few days, we've heard, obviously the White Sox and the Dodgers. The Yankees are a team that I'm definitely going to focus on, because it is evident that this team has more hitters than we expected, or I'm sorry, need for more hitters than expected. Looking at what they've not had with DJ LeMahieu, looking at the sort of up and down performance from Anthony Volpe, looking at the fact that Gleyber Torres does not appear like he's going to be retained. Anthony Rizzo was injured again, but even before that and before the emergence of Ben Rice, they were going to be probably looking at that position. Jose Trevino has stayed solid on defense, but he's not providing on offense. And then, of course, there's sort of like that tossing around in terms of what to do with Verdugo and such. So for a team that's gotten to a really impressive place record-wise, it's astonishing that they did so up until June 15th, when you look at the struggles that so many of their guys have had. Now, to be fair, Carlos Rodon turned in a really fantastic start today. They've had some upside and some bright lights since the second half kicked off that are having people a little bit more encouraged. But again, it's New York. You're always going to be getting a lot of what have you done for me lately? But it's on steroids. What have you done for me in the last 2 days, really? Now, the one team that I will say there's been some legitimate traction on with regard to the Yankees is discussions involving the Tampa Bay Rays. Both teams have been scouting one another recently. This is according to multiple reports. The Rays have several players who could fit needs that the Yankees have, whether that's a reliever. You've got guys like Pete Fairbanks, who a lot of people are high on. You've got starting pitchers, including someone who a lot of people think is underrated, guys like Zach Eflin, who is under control not only this year but next year. He's under control for $18 million, and the Rays just don't seem like the type of team that would be paying $18 million for a starting pitcher in a walk year. But a couple of other guys who have come to the discussion have been guys like Isaac Paredes, who is one of the, I would consider him one of the more polarizing players for the Rays. Although that being said, he definitely is somebody who, on his upside and on his best days, would definitely slot in as one of the better players. Although his analytical metrics and profile just don't really are not particularly optimistic with regard to what he could do long term. But he's somebody that they'll look at. A guy that I'm sure that they're looking at also is Randy Arozarena, who is one of the more, he kind of took over for Evan Longoria in terms of a Rays player who just has been a thorn in New York's side, and they love going after guys who have done that to them. See Jacoby Ellsbury about a decade ago, even though that turned into one of the worst contracts in New York history. So that is the one area in terms of specifics that I'll talk about for New York. Is I do think there's a legitimate deal to be made there potentially for the Tampa Bay Rays and the New York Yankees. I think there's a solid match there potentially. The only other player who I will say specifically that I could see them genuinely going and specifically going after is Luis Rengifo from the Anaheim Angels. He's injured, but he's believed to be kind of toward the end of that stint. And although, again, people are going to say, oh, the Yankees going after another injured player or another guy with an injured history. However, he is somebody who's got a solid profile in terms of getting on base. Now, that said, I wouldn't be a huge fan of this because he's not a great defender and he's not somebody who walks a lot or anything like that. So I'm not really sure that I would do that. Frankly, if I'm making that type of a move and I'm going after that type of a player, I'm bringing back a guy that I think they never should have let go of last year or at the end of last year. I'm calling up another division rival. I'm calling up the Toronto Blue Jays, and I'm getting Isaiah Kiner-Falefa back in New York as quickly as possible. They shouldn't have let him go. He was one of their best hitters when it came to, everybody was saying, we need defense, we need utility, we need contact, we need speed, and we need a guy who can put the ball in play in clutch moments. IKF did every single one of those things. So the fact that they let him go, and now, of course, the fans who were bashing him for a year and a half on X and Facebook and, New York Post and WFAN and Mike Francesa and God knows who else, and the K Show, all the guys who were ripping him and all these things are now saying, oh, we never should have let him go. Yeah, well, you don't know what you've got until it's gone. I mean, you pay attention. But so, yeah, if they're going to go after somebody, as opposed to Rengifo, I'd rather go back and just get IKF back from Toronto. Keith says, evening scoop. Jody says, Astros back in first place, just a matter of time. Keith, good evening. Hope you had a nice weekend and hope you had a good week last week. It's good to see you again. And Jody, thanks for coming on. I hope you're doing well. And yes, your Astros, as a lot of us, I think, expected that was going to be something that was going to manifest in the not too distant future. And it looks like that has definitely begun to take hold, or maybe past begun. It definitely has taken hold, I would say. Also, just again, hate to bring this up, but again, it is relevant sports news with regard to we were just talking about the Yankees, so I do just want to express my condolences for Omar Minaya. He's one of the top executives for the Yankees. He lost his wife at the age of 55 this weekend. So obviously just sad news in New York, but they honored her today, and I wanted to also just mention that as well, since I was talking about the team. Another thing, going to cross sports a little bit, but another thing that came out today, and I always enjoy looking at these types of things, because you've got places, whether it's The Athletic or ESPN, or these league networks, whether it's MLB Network or NFL Network or CBS Sports, Fox Sports, whatever it is, and they like doing these whole sort of these future power rankings, these sort of where we think teams will be in 3 years or 5 years. And ESPN released theirs with regard to where they thought each team would be in, I think this was a 5-year span that they were looking at. And so they released teams 1 through 32. And I took a look at some of these. They've got the Chiefs at 1, the Ravens at 2, the Bills at 3, Lions at 4, Eagles at 5. So I don't have a ton of beef with that top 5. And just the criteria they did based on 4 things: overall roster, quarterback, coaching, front office, which makes a lot of sense. That's typically what a lot of people, including myself, would base things on, and breaking it down in that way. With regard to those things, I don't have a ton of beef with most of this list. I think that the Eagles at 5 is fair. I think that the Lions at 4 is definitely fair. I think that the Bills at 3 is definitely my biggest discrepancy, or my biggest beef that I have with this list, just because, again, I don't see how much more the Bills have shown in any of those 3 capacities in the last couple of years than teams like the Lions or the Eagles. Or going down a little bit further, the Texans are kind of new on the scene, but then you got the 49ers after that. You got the Bengals after that. I'm not seeing what the Bills have shown so much more than these teams underneath them, that they keep getting these top scores. And I'm looking at the breakdown for the Bills. They've got overall roster ranked 10th. They've got quarterback ranked 2nd, coaching ranked 9th, front office ranked 4th. I think front office ranked 4th is, again, pretty fair. Overall roster 10th, I can get behind that. And coaching 9th, I'm not as much of a fan of Sean McDermott as some people are, but if you want to call him an edge top 10 coach, especially since I think this takes into account the whole staff, not just head coach, I don't have an issue with that. How are we continuing to call Josh Allen the second best quarterback in the NFL? This guy, I don't know what again, everybody evaluates quarterbacks differently in either micro aspects or macro aspects. I don't know what they're using to break. That's what I don't know, is I don't know what they're using to break down quarterback play. But again, I think we've all baked in the fact that it's Pat Mahomes and then the field. There's very little argument beyond that. How is the number 1 QB in the field? How are we just supposed to accept that Josh Allen is the number 1 QB in the so-called field? He's the absolute number 1 best of the next 31 quarterbacks. Like, show me the evidence of this. He hasn't gotten them to a Super Bowl. The couple of big games that he's gotten them to in the postseason, he's been the main reason why they lost most of those. And his biggest takeoff was when they brought in Stephon Diggs, who is now no longer on the roster. And this is a future ranked list. And I want to see what he looks like without Stephon Diggs still on the roster. Now, they have Dalton Kincaid, they have James Cook. But this is his first time in several years trying to make it happen without Stephon Diggs. And he doesn't have some of the same pieces on his defense that he did a few years ago. So, again, just show it to me. What am I missing with Josh Allen that apparently everybody in football media is seeing? Because when I see him, I don't care if I'm looking at stats or if I'm watching him or whatever the case may be, I see a physical freak, like a physically imposing, player who can jump over guys, who hasn't won any big games, and who has hurt his team in several big games. He had a fantastic season last year, and I gave him that. I gave him his props, and I said I did not expect him to do as well as he did. But number 2 ranked quarterback among the non-Pat, and number 1 among the non-Pat Mahomes population, I don't know where I'm seeing that from. Because if I look around, now again, I don't know exactly what this breakdown is based on. But I look around the league. You've got guys like Lamar Jackson. You've got guys like, excuse me, you've got guys like, now Joe Burrow is kind of hard because he might be the biggest case purely on his ability and his talent and his track record, but I understand the injuries can be, an argument against him. You've got people like Matt Stafford, who, again, people think he's on the decline, although I don't think he's declined as fast as some people expected, and he does have arguably one of the more accomplished resumes in the NFL at quarterback. So if you're going off of what he's actually done and what he's actually accrued, both stats and winning wise, he'd be one of the top arguments, I think. So if it's just because you have to put someone there and you're kind of splitting hairs, then fine. But it feels like this is almost like a consensus belief, and I just don't know what I'm missing, because I think there's a legitimate argument for all 3 of those guys. Pardon me. I think there's a legitimate argument for all 3 of those guys. I look around the league. Now, again, we don't know what we're going to get from Aaron Rodgers with the Jets. We don't know what we're going to get in follow-up years with guys like Jordan Love or the quarterback from C.J. Stroud from Houston. We don't know what we're going to get with Justin Herbert. A lot of people expect that he's going to take a big step with Harbaugh there, but we have to see it. So in the sense that there's not really a consensus number 2, I can completely agree with that. But it feels like people are trying to argue that Allen is the consensus 2. And I don't know, maybe one of y'all can point out something to me that I'm missing, because I am not seeing it. Jody says, Bills wide receivers are who again? Absolutely. How are the Bengals that high? What have they done? Again, I throw them in there just because, again, they've got Jamar Chase, who I'm going to talk about in a second. They had Chase, they had Higgins, they had Mixon, and they had Burrow, and they at least went to a Super Bowl a few years ago. So again, in my mind, at least they had that going for them, as with regard to Buffalo. And yeah, Jody says next, what have they done? Says made a Super Bowl. So again, I'm not saying that I definitely would put them at number 2. I think that Burrow for a while I thought had as close to a stronghold on the second spot as anybody, but with his injuries, and now I don't know if you guys heard what happened today, but it sounds like it's more possible than ever that Jamar Chase may be leaving Cincinnati within the next year or so. It does not sound like they're particularly optimistic on the possibility of getting a deal worked out between the 2 sides, which isn't surprising since Mike Brown is notoriously one of the cheapest owners in sports, and he really doesn't ever pay big money for anything or anybody. So that's not entirely surprising, but it is disappointing, obviously, if you're a Bengals fan or somebody who just wants to see good football in other places. But again, I don't see the argument for Josh Allen as that consensus. Jody Moncrief says Allen or Hurts. It depends on the specific question, honestly. Like, if you're asking me who's accomplished more, it's definitely Hurts, because he's gone to a Super Bowl and he has, he's gone to a Super Bowl and he's gone toe to toe and arguably outplayed Mahomes on the biggest stage, even though they lost, because that was due to obviously defense and the whole other situation with Gannon that I'm not going to get into. But if you're asking me who has a higher upside, I think Allen has like the higher ceiling, but I also think he has the lower floor. 5-year projection: Burrow is no longer in the league due to injuries. Unfortunately, so about a decade ago, I was I'll never forget this, and I don't know why, because it wasn't the most consequential memory in the world, but I was on the phone with my grandfather, and I was at the school that I was going to at the time, and I was on the phone with my grandfather, and we were talking about quarterbacks, and for whatever reason, I said, I don't know like we were talking about quarterbacks, and I said I think that RG3 is going to be out of the league within the next 3 years. Like, it is really unfortunate the way that these great players can just, or at least great talents. He never really got to express or establish himself as a great player long term in the NFL. But just kind of example where it's just like, no matter how talented you are, injuries can bring you down at any position, especially quarterback. And I would hate to see that happen to him because, again, I obviously never want to see anybody go down, especially never want to see somebody's career end due to injuries. But it wouldn't surprise me at all. Again, offensive line, similar thing that I said with Buffalo. Buffalo and Cincinnati, terrible at developing and drafting offensive lines. And I mean, at least Buffalo plays a little bit more in the go and get guys off your team, go and get guys from outside your team space, whereas Cincinnati pretty much avoids that like the plague in a lot of cases. But yeah, so I was just looking at that list. Now, again, now I'll go with the bottom real quick and just kind of talk about how that was looked at a little bit. You're going to look at the bottom 5. The lowest spot that they had was the Las Vegas Raiders, which I don't have much of an issue with. New Orleans Saints don't have a lot of issue with, even though I am higher on Derek Carr than they are, having him at number 28. But again, like, there's just not a lot of excitement in New Orleans, and I can understand that and understand why. And when you break it down by roster, QB, coaching, or front office, this is a team that treats the cap not differently, but treats the cap as more of it's tomorrow's problem than anybody else in the NFL. And that is rapidly coming around on them, especially with the fact that guys like Thomas, et cetera, and Kamara, et cetera, are either no longer in their prime, or both. So I think that this is something where, again, they were kind of just pushing it off until Peyton and Breeze were gone, and they juiced that orange for a lot longer than I expected that they would, but they're kind of paying the price for it now, or at least they're about to. Panthers are third from the bottom, which, again, I think is fair. I do like Coach Canales. I think that was a solid hire. And obviously, I do still have hopes for Bryce Young at quarterback. But, I mean, again, what have the Panthers proven to show that they can do it? And they think that they might have one of the most radioactive owners in not just NFL, but all of sports. Next, number 29, New York Giants. In the breakdown, they've got roster 29, quarterback 31, coaching 19, front office 31. I don't have a ton of beef with any of that from a ranking standpoint. 31st for the front office might be a little bit low. I think that might be a little bit unfair. Not really to say much great about them, but I think that there's more than one worse front office than them. But I think everything else is about fair. And then rounding out that bottom 5 is the Arizona Cardinals, which, isolating my anti-Cardinals bias as best as I can. Yes, I think bottom 3 for coaching, which is what they have here. I think that's fair. Quarterback 23, that to me is low. I think Murray deserves higher than that, especially how he performed after coming back from his ACL injury, and now he's going to have Marvin Harrison Jr., who I'm surprised fell to number 4. So I think that's a little bit low. At least if you're allowing me to factor in quarterback by the talent around him, which will obviously increase his production, then I think 23 is low. But the overall roster around him, 27, and front office 22. I think those are fair. Front office might be a little bit high for me, but again, I might be looking at that a little bit more subjectively. And then 27 is Denver, but you've heard me talk about Denver before. Clayton Heron says, hey guys, smash that like button and share, guys. Man, my Brewers aren't playing well against the Cubs. Mr. Heron, I hope you're doing well. I mean, again, your Brewers, I've touted pretty much every show as, in my opinion, the best, or not best, but the biggest surprise of any team in MLB this year, that maybe other than the Cleveland Guardians. So I'm not going to take much. I'm not going to talk much junk against your Brewers with how they've played this year and the circumstances under which they did that. So, yeah, I'm not going to be too harsh on y'all for what I've seen from y'all so far this season. But yeah, and then it's interesting because we haven't heard a ton in terms of what's going on around baseball with regard to actual moves just yet. Sometimes you'll see one or two of those major moves happen earlier on, but that really hasn't happened yet. The Phillies released Whit Merrifield, who just jumped on today with Atlanta and proceeded to injure himself literally within a couple of hours of joining the team facility, which is unfortunate. The Braves also put Max Fried on the injured list, but as I've said, that team has perhaps the deepest pitching staff and best pitching staff perhaps in all of baseball, at least when you're going from top to bottom. So I'm not going to bang on them too hard. They've had issues for sure, but I don't think that their pitching, starting pitching, I don't think has been considered one of them. I mean, we've seen what Chris Sale has done this season, but a lot more of it is mostly rumors and speculation. The only other one that's really hit has been, and I mentioned Evan Longoria earlier. He spoke a couple days ago to the Tampa Bay Times, to Mark Topkin of the Tampa Bay Times, and stated that he pretty much expects that his career is over, even though he isn't currently officially retiring. Sounds like Longo's time in MLB has come to an end, and obviously have a lot of respect for him from watching him for the longest time. Definitely watching him beat up on New York more than I would have ever liked to have seen, but nothing but respect for him, and I'll be curious to see if he stays around the game in some capacity. But just going into the trade deadline season, there's so many teams right now that are kind of, I think, wanting to believe that they are more in the mix than they actually are. Teams like the Cubs today, it's been kind of reported that barring a turnaround, they're looking more toward the future than this season, which, again, I came down on teams like the Marlins for sort of sending that message super early that they were prepared to look beyond. It's a little bit different to me now, coming toward the end of July, when you have to be realistic before the trade deadline. So I don't have them in as much of I don't have as much of a visceral reaction to them doing that that I did with regard to a team like the Marlins, because again, it's 2.5 months later, and you have to make a lot of these determinations in the next week or so, as opposed to somebody like them who was doing it literally a month into the season. But Jody says they need to trade Cody Bellinger. I feel like, I don't know. It's Cody Bellinger is one of those guys. He kind of falls in like the Chris Bryant category for me, where just because I remember how highly regarded he was for a period of time, that still hearing his name in certain capacities is just weird to me, because in my brain, I'm remembering that guy who was hitting 50 home runs in LA. I'm remembering that guy who was, MVP caliber. I'm remembering that guy who got, a walk. It seems like every single game. It seemed like the guy was like Kevin Youkilis reincarnate. So to kind of see him being talked about as this kind of perpetual on the trade market is just kind of, I don't know. It's still weird to process for me, even though last year he did have a 2020 season, 26 home runs and 20 steals. So last year he was by no means a slouch. I don't mean to imply as such, but I don't know. It's just, and then Chris Bryant. I mean, for a long period of time, we all remember that Chris Bryant was somebody who, he was, again, an MVP caliber in his own right. Guy hit 30 homers a season for, it was like 6 seasons, I think it was. Obviously was a key member of that team that went and broke the curse in Chicago in 2016. But then, the end of his time in Chicago and now going to Colorado, I thought going to Colorado was going to really break him out. I thought he was going to, I thought his 30 homer seasons were going to become 40 homer seasons. I thought his, 270, 280 batting averages were going to become 310, 320. I thought his, 450, 500 slugging were going to become 550. And, we kind of saw, not just did we not see that, but we kind of saw the opposite of that, in addition to all these injury situations that he's developed. And then not only the injury situations, but seemingly, not the greatest cultural fit either. So, that's a fun situation for them to be locked into at the tune of $26 million a year for the next, 5 seasons, I think. But yeah, no, I think Bellinger is somebody who I could see Chicago trading for sure. If they do look into doing that, it might be the first time that I can remember that I don't hear him connected strongly to the Yankees. That was obviously the huge fit that everyone loves to draw for a long period of time. I think that that's not as likely to happen this year. Just just based on the fact that most of his time has been spent at center field and right field, and those are arguably the only two positions that the Yankees don't need to improve. So I'll be excited to kind of see them stay out of that whole discussion this time around if he does end up getting on the trade block. But I think the teams are probably going to want to see a little bit more off of him or coming off of his injury. He just came off the IL about a week ago, and teams might want to get another look at him for another few games beforehand because he had a couple of offers going against Anaheim, and and he definitely had or has not had the strongest streak offensively in these last few games since he came off the IL. So they might be making a last-minute decision on that. Off the top of your head, top 3 baseball players stealing money right now. As in not playing up to their contract. That's a fun question. So in terms of I'm not going to include, I think, the first name people are going to want to ask is probably Ohtani. I'm not including Ohtani. I'm not including, guys like Judge or Harper, guys who are they're the biggest contracts, but I think that they're also playing up to reasonably their values, I guess you'd say. I'd probably throw Manny Machado up there just because he's the one main one I can think of who was brought in with the expectation of leading their team to a title and hasn't done that. All the other guys who got big contracts either just got them or have led their team to at least one title. Excuse me. Obviously, that's not the case with Judge and Cole, but those two guys have not in any way been a factor in that, the team's inability to do that. So, yeah, I'd put Machado up there. I thought that Xander Bogaerts got overpaid, but I'm going to give you two teams. I'm going to try and split this between different teams. I definitely think Anthony Rendon should be in that conversation. Although I do like Rendon, and I didn't take as much of an issue with some of his statements as some other people did, or I at least was able to, I think, kind of see behind them a little bit more than some other people. But in that respect, I think it was kind of difficult. And then maybe I would go with one of the guys that the Mets paid, not because that they're any sort of terrible team necessarily or were terrible deals necessarily, but just because they paid so much money and they're no longer on those teams. So that'd be the two Mets guys, Scherzer and Verlander. That's kind of just off the top of my head. I know those were short-term deals, but again, just paying. They're still paying Bobby Bonilla, for God's sakes, and now you're paying 40-some million. I don't know how much of each deal they're paying off the top of my head, but to still be paying players that aren't playing for you, especially off that level, and guys who, I don't think had really shown particularly a lot of decline in their games compared to what people might have expected and what you might have gotten in most cases had those deals been applied to other players who. I'm going to restart that sentence. I think that there's a lot of cases where the money that you'd pay for a starting pitcher at the ages that they were at, typically you don't get the ROI for paying that level of money to that age of pitcher that I think you would have gotten by keeping Scherzer and Verlander. So I don't think they got terrible returns on prospects, but I just think that paying over $40 million for 30 some odd pitchers that you don't even have anymore who are still playing particularly or somewhat well, if that made any more sense. So yeah, those would be my three answers. It'd be Machado, one of the two Mets pitchers, and Rendon. Jody says 1 is Chris Bryant, 2 is Jose Abreu till we cut him, 3 is DJ LeMay. I don't disagree that LeMahieu was turned out to be a bad contract, but his contract was only 6 years, $90 million. When I was talking about like stealing money, not playing to their contract, I'm like, if I'm really trying to think of you as like a horrible contract, then you got to be making $200-300 million on that deal, or at least making like 40 some odd million a year. Like that's what I really think. If you're in New York, I mean, $15 million a year in New York, especially for a guy who was playing very well at the beginning of his deal, hardly somebody that I would include on that list. It does obviously look like a bad deal now, or it does look like, he's not making his return on investment now, but he was one of their top players a couple of years ago on the beginning of that deal. So I'm not going to look at that whole contract as an absolute bust. Thank you for having Rendon on the list. Trout should be on this list. Okay, I'm going to hardcore disagree with that right now. And here's the reason why. Excuse me, sorry. One, I tend to give a little bit of I tend to think of it a little bit differently in terms of players who got hurt, because as opposed to decline or as opposed to other things, injuries are a lot more difficult to foresee, a lot more, they're a lot more random, I would say. And Trout also, excuse me, the only reason Anaheim had a hope and a prayer, sorry, Keith, the only reason Anaheim had a hope and a prayer of being competitive the last few years was because of Trout and Ohtani. They never could develop pitching. They never could fill out that bullpen. They never could, they tried, what the hell was that guy's name? There was a corner outfielder that they had who was pretty solid, but they never could really build out a team around them. So I think that Trout also, I mean, the amount of injuries he had, I'm surprised he didn't injure his back more from carrying that whole team on his back. But it is unfortunate because I think his injuries, perhaps, I hate using this phrase, but quote unquote, robbed us of perhaps one of the greatest players of all time, or one of the greatest careers of all time, I should say. But I think going back then, I definitely would have made, I still would have made that deal. And I don't think that compared to some of the other moves that they've made and some of the other contracts that exist, I don't think that Trout is when he's able to play specifically, I don't think that he's really that far below his contract value, if that makes sense. Was moving DJ to third a bad move? This is always the difficulty that I have with questions like that is, and it's on me. It's but it's because I will tend to look at things from two perspectives. One, did it work out okay? And two, how did it look when they actually made the move in the first place? Now, in terms of how it looked when they actually made the move in the first place, I don't think it looked bad at all, because he's played a good amount of third base ever since he got to New York, and he played several seasons of very solid third base there. So I don't think that in that sense, I don't think that was a bad move. In fact, there's a couple of seasons where he played more at third base than he played for us at any other position. Last year was one of them, and he played particularly decently there, pretty solid there. I think this year his decline on defense is also exacerbated by the fact that he's literally one of the worst players in all of baseball offensively. I think if he were being held up a little bit better by offensive numbers, he may be given a little bit more of a leeway on his defense. But because his offensive numbers are so atrocious, I think that sort of double whammy is giving him a lot less grace than people may otherwise have. Now, again, I know that New York fans and grace don't really go hand in hand, but hopefully my point makes sense. I mean, and I pulled it up real quickly in terms of, so he has 142 plate appearances this year, so I'll just go with 140 to keep it at a round number. Among guys who have as many plate appearances as he does, excuse me, he's got the 10th worst batting average in the whole MLB among those players. He's got the 7th worst weighted runs created, that sort of all-encompassing stat that I utilize. In terms of on-base percentage, he's sitting at, all right, that suddenly didn't show up. I apologize. But yeah, I mean, you get the point. And his slugging is quite literally the worst in Major League Baseball. So you're talking about a guy who's in contention for the worst offensive player in all of baseball right now, or really this whole season. So that's definitely hurting. I think that his defense, I don't think his defense has actually been terrible this season. I mean, he's made a couple of misplays recently that obviously from optically have been terrible. But I think that is additionally exacerbated by the fact that, one, he's been terrible offensively all season. He's been a black hole in that lineup. Excuse me. And the fact that from a power number standpoint, he makes me at 12U look like the Silver Slugger. I think it all was just building on itself. And the fact that it was happening since that June 15th, when everything has seemingly gone to hell in a handbasket for New York. I think all those things compounded upon one another. I think contextualized is a lot different. Scoop, how do you fix the current NFL training camp and preseason to get a better product for coaches and players? Do you mind specifying that a little bit? I'm not quite sure what you mean by better product for coaches and players. Pujols hurt the Angels so much, in my opinion. That was, that was definitely, and I was only going off of existing contracts. But yeah, that was definitely a very rough one. A lot of people, including myself, I don't think saw that being how that worked out. I mean, it also calls to mind, obviously I'm going way back now, but calls to mind, the Josh Hamilton situation. Obviously that came with a lot of things off the field as well. And, I hope that he's doing better now and hope that his family's doing better now. But yeah, Anaheim has just been, there are a lot of similarities. I hate to say it, but there are a lot of similarities between Anaheim and Colorado, where it's like, I respect a lot of the risks that they take. It just seems they either take the worst calculated ones or the ones that they take just blow up in their face. Jody says Gold Glove second baseman in Colorado. Yeah, again, his defense on the whole is not something that I typically have a lot of beef about. It's just the fact that it's compounded by the fact that everybody in New York, almost everybody in New York, has been struggling the past month or so. He's having, again, a year offensively that makes him on par with some of the worst in all of Major League Baseball. So those things, and Aaron Boone was correct. And, people in New York don't like that I'm, as much of a defender, I guess, of Aaron Boone, but he was correct. When things are going awry, everything gets magnified. I do not think that people would be, again, I'm not excusing the two really badly misplayed and the optics of that from the two plays that most New York fans know what I'm talking about. But in a scenario in which, he's not playing like quite, again, literally the worst hitter in all of baseball, and in a situation where the Yankees are not literally the worst record in all of baseball the last month and 7 days, I don't think that I don't think his whole season of defense becomes as defined by those two blunders. But excuse me. But yeah, no, I think that if you go back to, we were talking, you were asking about, or somebody was asking about third base for New York. That's not a position that I think is going to be their main target at the deadline per se. I think that I think there's a lot of positions where they could, quote unquote, improve. I thought that first baseman was going to be their main one, but I think that they're going to let it ride with Ben Rice. Excuse me. But in terms of just the pitching situation, where just so many of their pitchers who were doing fantastically just suddenly fell off when they got back Garrett Cole, no less, which was perhaps the most confusing part of it all. I think that became sort of a major disconnect there. I'd be probably more inclined to believe that maybe second base would be a position that they look at if they look at a position on the position player side. Second base would probably be more where I would look. I wouldn't rule out looking at third base, but I think that they believe that they've got bigger needs. Yeah, Keith, going back to your question about fixing NFL training camp and preseason, I don't know if this is exactly what you were going for, but it is something that I'll keep in mind, or that I have in mind, rather. I know that there was discussion. I don't know if it was perpetuated by Commissioner Goodell or if it was just something that he commented on, but I could definitely see a situation in which they continue to cut down the number of preseason games. Pardon. Either turn that into either another regular season game, or at least turn that into an extension of training camp or something like that. I don't really know how they would reconfigure that, but I don't know, because I think a lot of people look at those preseason games and think that for those sort of first 48 or so players on that roster, there's not a ton that it really means. Or at least that first, maybe 48 is too high, but the first 30 some odd players on that roster, there's not a ton it really means. A lot of guys are really just taking their 3 reps and jump out. And then the rest of the players are the ones fighting for those last few spots, are the ones who really take most of the or who really go at it full bore, and most of the other guys are just kind of trying not to get hurt. So that would kind of be the one aspect that I could really bring up. And because I think a lot of guys just look at it as a situation where they just run the risk of getting hurt. Not the greatest answer, but hopefully that kind of adds a little bit to what you were referring to. What are your thoughts watching Hard Knocks and how the Giants dealt with Barkley? All right. So I'm going to kind of how when players get elected to the MLB Hall of Fame, they can have a hat that kind of goes 2 logos if they split time with 2 different teams. I'm going to kind of do that. I'm going to have half my analyst hat on and half my fan hat on. Because obviously it's no secret that I, as a diehard Eagles fan, was ecstatic to get Saquon Barkley. Was ecstatic to see him come over to Philly from New York. Think that he's going to have a much better opportunity to stay healthy and produce in Philly, because 1, he's not going to be the focal point of the offense, and 2, he's going to be behind a much better offensive line and with a much better offensive coach, in my opinion. But just in terms of what I saw, I think that does happen probably a lot more than we're privy to. I think a lot of times that sort of dynamic just kind of it circulated more because, again, it involves 2 high-profile teams, and it involves a star. It involves a player who's become a lightning rod because he went from one rival to another. All those different things. I think that again, it stinks, but again, it all comes down to whatever side you're on. It comes down to the fact that it's a business. I hate the fact that players, for example, can hear things. Players can find out that they get traded on, Twitter or X now, or find out, on ESPN that they got traded or cut, or get told on MLB trade rumors. They find out, or they get told by somebody who saw it, or whatever the case may be. But that sort of whole, sort of maneuver, I guess you want to call it, with regard to the Giants and Saquon. I'm not entirely surprised with that phone call. And now, to add some context for those who haven't seen it, basically Joe Schoen and Saquon were on the phone, and basically Joe Schoen made it sound like, Joe Schoen basically made it sound like there's a number at which we'll keep you, but if you can make that work, call us back after meeting with other teams, and we'd love to have you. And then Saquon at that point sounded like he wanted to remain with New York. And I've got the quote here just from Joe Schoen that I'll add. It says, "I think just mulling over this, the right thing to do is let you test the market and see what your value is. I don't want to do the franchise thing, the franchise tag, and all of that again. I don't want to go through that. We've both been through that. If you really want to be a Giant for life and you're interested in staying here and coming back, just see what your market is and have Ed," I presume that's his agent, "come back to us, and we'll see if we can come to an agreement." Shane did ask whether Barkley would allow the Giants to match any offer, and it was never clear as to if that wound up happening. And then Barkley signed a 3-year, $37.8 million deal with Philly in free agency. Again, I think that a lot of that probably happens a lot more than fans are privy to. A lot of times we see it on the player side of things. We see situations in which, if a guy is a free agent and doesn't always give his team that he's leaving or that he may leave a chance to sort of beat the offer or match the offer, or whatever the case may be. It sounds like a lot of posturing. I'm not entirely surprised from a standpoint of, again, in terms of where they're at as an organization. They didn't know what they were going to do with quarterback because it's, again, at the time, remember, free agency was before the draft. So at the time, they didn't really know if they were going to be able to, or what they were going to do, if they were going to have Daniel Jones and a rookie, or what they were going to do, even though they had already paid Daniel Jones that money. And then, so to add on top of that, I think that maybe also played a factor in, they have so much kind of uncertainty, both that and still trying to build up that O-line and the weapons and such. They probably thought, is running back with this sort of roster that we're still trying to build, is running back a position we really want to pay big money to, especially somebody who's already gotten hurt behind the O-line that we have. So I don't blame them, honestly. Again, from a purely objective standpoint, just looking at it as a team with a star running back who's been hurt, who doesn't 100% know their long-term quarterback situation, and whose O-line isn't one of the best in the game. I can see from their standpoint why they set a line in the sand, so to speak. And I can also see why Saquon was not thrilled about the way that he felt he was treated when he expressed that he wanted to stay. I don't think either side is in the wrong. I think it's just part of the business of sports. Jody says, will someone sign Trevor Bauer? I certainly hope so. And I've kind of, played soft on that in the past because, again, there were, in the beginning when I first started the show, kind of some of the legal stuff was either still wrapping up or whatever the case may be. We have a league right now where guys who have been either charged or like there's visible proof, either firsthand or secondhand, that they've actually committed these offenses, et cetera, are actively on teams. They're actively promoted by the teams that they're on. They're actively promoted by league social media. They're actively promoted by these networks and whatnot that are, airing their teams and their games and such, both as part of the team and individually. The fact that Trevor Bauer, who was not proven to have, nearly that, doesn't have nearly that level of proof or nearly that level of incrimination against him, and has already been suspended for 2 years, not having that same level, I think is remarkably misguided. I think it's wrong. It still upsets me. And if I found out tomorrow New York was signing Trevor Bauer, I'd be ecstatic. I would love it if the Yankees would sign Trevor Bauer. And whoever does sign Trevor Bauer this season, if they do, I think that they're capitalizing on an opportunity that I hope they make the other 29 teams regret, no matter who it is. Keith says, Scoop, you are blessed enough that you could be a star at any position, any sport, any team. What is it? Since baseball's always been kind of my main love in terms of sports, I'll go with baseball. I've always loved the idea of being not just a pitcher, but a relief pitcher. I love the idea of coming in and when, the game is the most on the line. I love the idea of going in, not necessarily in the 9th inning, because sometimes your biggest outs sometimes are in the 5th inning or the 6th inning when there's, bases loaded and, 1 out and you've got, the best player on the other team at the plate. So I'd love to be a relief pitcher. This is going to sound a little bit funny. The team I would probably want to play for, I think, would be the Detroit Tigers. And here's the reason for that. I'll kind of explain that a little bit. I love the Yankees so much, but I genuinely mean it when I say I would not want to play for them. I see the way that fans rip players, again, not just because, oh, they stink or whatever the case may be, but like genuinely rip players, even when they're doing well, for just the most random reasons, and the way that fans get treated, like, or players get treated when they're like out in public and such. And I would not genuinely want to be a part of that. So the two teams that I could see would be either the Tigers, or perhaps, because I think that they're at least a more loving version of what you get in New York, the Philadelphia Phillies would be probably the other one. Jody Moncrief says, hope Houston signs him. Yeah, I could definitely see that being, again, they did, again, it's a much different sort of side of things, because with Ozuna, there was a lot more hardcore meat on the bone in terms of the incrimination against him. So, but, they have brought in guys with sort of quote unquote checkered past, or, people who have questions against them, guys like Ozuna and such. And it has worked out for them. So that's somebody else I could see them doing. I think, if I remember correctly, I think that Hunter Strickland also went there. If that's the other guy, there's another guy who I'm pretty sure went there, who had similar kind of questions about his character. I don't know I think it was Strickland, but I could be wrong. But there was somebody else as well. So, and I also just think that he might be the perfect, I hate to put it this way, but he might be the perfect sort of double down on like we're the villain type team, because teams don't want to be that team to sign him, but also in a sort of an actual like hardcore factual standpoint, teams are really running low on actual reasons not to. They just don't want to be the team to. Houston being the team to, I could 100% see, and just doubling down on that, we're the new evil empire type of thing. And quite frankly, I'd respect it. Kurt says, Scoops. Kurt, how you doing, my friend? Hope you're doing well. Hope you're feeling better, first and foremost. Hope you and Hoopsy are doing well. Glad that you were able to make it on tonight at, excuse me, with regard to, even being on a different day and time. But Keith, I want to ask you that same question. Any star at any position, any sport, any team. Curious what your answer would be. Because excuse me, I'm sure a lot of people didn't expect to hear me say relief pitcher for the Tigers or Phillies. But yeah, coming off of that real quick, obviously, and I'm not going to get into this a ton until it actually kicks off. But obviously, the Olympics do start this coming Friday. We've got like the opening and such out of Paris. That's going from July 26th to August 11th. So looking forward to getting that kicked off from the Stade de France. I'm going to be excited to kind of obviously hope and watch and see what the USA is able to accomplish. It's going to be hopefully a particularly uplifting moment at a time when I think a lot of people, not just in the country, but in the world, could definitely use something of that nature. Pardon. But I think that, hang on, got an update here. Okay. The Detroit Pistons, if Carson's watching, the Detroit Pistons have hired 2 new executives. They've hired J.R. Holden, who was the former Nets director of player personnel, as an executive, and they've hired Gianluca Pascucci, which I'm already a fan of because that's definitely an Italian name. He's joined the Pistons front office as well for an unnamed position. Keith says, I'd play tight end for my Denver Broncos. You would follow in the footsteps of one of my favorite sports analysts, or whatever you want to call him, reporter, analyst, commentator, whatever you want to call him, in Shannon Sharpe. So that'd be fun to watch. And obviously, that I'm a fan of Bo Nix, so that'd be a lot of fun as well. But I love that. Oh, what did I just do? Okay. That being said, looks like we're coming up right on the so-called buzzer. Excuse me. Just a couple things I just want to mention real quick before I do wrap up the show. So, and I'll use this time to let anybody else who wants to just drop in a comment or a question, and I'll answer those at the very end. But real quick, I just want to say, going to be back on this coming Thursday with regard to settle the scores. I'm going to keep posting updates and such next couple weeks. The timing and the days at times are going to be shifting a little bit, sort of week to week, with regard to both this show and settle the scores, due to the personal stuff that I've kind of talked about a little bit with regard to my relocation and a couple of other things. So just be on the lookout for that. But I'm going to do obviously the best that I can to continue as much content as possible. I love doing this stuff, and no matter what state I'm in, I intend to continue trying to work with you guys and grow this thing. It's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy the time that we get to spend doing all of this. So just be on the lookout for that, and just be on the lookout for that from the other show as well. And I want to thank again both Trevor and Kenny for their support and assistance the other night in my absence. But yes, that show is going to be on for this Thursday, and at this time, I'll be back on Sunday, this regular time, this Sunday, July 28th, 9 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Mountain, with regard to having What's the Scoop on. Also, just want to send out a message of shout out. We all sometimes, when things get a little bit get bigger than sports, we all kind of end sometimes shows with shout out one thing or another. I want to just shout out kind of generally my whole friend group, guys that I grew up with back home in my home district of Honeoye Falls, Lima. Guys that I went to church with, guys that I played baseball with, grew up with, are sort of cast of characters from my time growing up with all of them. We lost suddenly a very important member of that group, somebody who we all loved, was a teammate of ours, was a friend of ours, a brother of ours. Jack T was suddenly passed away this weekend, and I just want to say I love you guys. To the Verdict family, I love you guys, and just keeping everybody from my hometown in my prayers. And appreciate that some of y'all do tune in and watch this show. But we all won that championship in 2013, and you'd be hard pressed to find a bigger champion in that game, in that series, and in life than Jack was. So I love you guys, and may our brother rest in peace. So thanks y'all for letting me share that. And pardon me. And with that being said, going forward, like I said, I will see you guys on Thursday night. Settle the Scores is back 9 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Mountain. And on Sunday night, be back on this channel with What's the Scoop, 9 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Mountain. As I say, same scoop time, same scoop channel. Scoop out.